Hello, and welcome to Thoughts on Therapy. I'm Bryan Stevens, a licensed professional counselor for the practice in Marietta, Georgia, and the founder of TalkForward, who's bringing us this podcast today. I've been active in behavioral health for over 25 years, and in that time, I've met all sorts of knowledgeable people. Thoughts on Therapy is the show to bring their knowledge to the general public. Today, we're talking with Dr. Paul Buchanan on being stuck with a story, why we resist change. Dr. Buchanan is a psychologist, inspirational speaker, consultant, and author. Her works include a book, The Clinician's Guide to Pathological Ambivalence, workbooks on understanding and resolving ambivalence, the workbook, I'm Not Good Enough, How These Stories You Tell Yourself Are Ruining Your Life, and Eating in Peace, Healing Your Relationship with Food and Your Body. She also has two blogs, From One Therapist to Another, and Change Your Story, Change Your Life. All righty, well, thank you so much for being here today. And I'm very excited to be talking to you, having looked at your blog and some other things. So you have added to my homework of things that I have to do each week in reading, which is good. So kind of starting off, Dr. Buchanan, you specialize as a psychologist in helping people change. And then a lot of what you write, though, is focuses on why it's hard for people to change. So I was kind of wondering, we might open up with talking a little bit about that focus that you have.
Okay, well, I did work for 25 years in the area of eating disorders, and people with eating disorders are really torn between what's making them feel like they're okay, and yet at the same time causing all kinds of problems. And so I worked for a long time with people who had a lot of ambivalence about change, even though at least part of them really wanted to change. And so the change is just really hard. And I'm sure anybody listening to this has tried to change something and gotten frustrated with themselves, maybe even feel guilt or shame. It's part of the human condition. Our brains are wired to be forming habits. Everything you do can become a habit. And so anything that you've done, and people think habits are just behaviors, but it's not just a behavior, it's also emotions. Any human experience can become a habit. So if you have for your entire life felt like you were inadequate in some way, well, that's a habit in your brain. That has a lot of brain real estate.
Right.
And so it's going to be hard to change no matter how committed you are. And the other thing is that we are complex as human beings. We have a complicated brain. We can look at things from lots of different perspectives. And therefore, it's as if we have parts. One part of us might want to change, while another part is afraid of the change or anxious or doesn't feel like we deserve it, or so many different reasons that we might hesitate or feel like we can't.
Right. It makes a lot of sense. And one of the things I've seen with my clients a lot when we talk about change or wanting to do things is, and I like the term story because I like stories, I like narratives. I've always liked Adler.
Me too.
And the idea is like, a lot of times we have a story, and that story has helped us get to today, survive to today. And there's often reasons, or we have habits, and you talk about those habits, those things help get us to where we are today. That may not be the best thing to use going forward. And what you talk about shame or guilt, one of the things I try to talk about with clients is, listen, you survived, here we are, congratulations. Now, how can we move forward and thrive?
Yeah.
A little bit more. But I think that generates a lot of sense of ambivalence about things. So I wonder if maybe you could talk to us a little bit about ambivalence. And when we from a psychological standpoint, what do we talk about when we mean ambivalence?
Well, ambivalence is just wanting two different things or believing two different things at the same time. So it's very normal. We all experience it. In fact, it can be healthy. And it's not the same thing as apathetic. It just means that you're really torn. And so, for instance, if I if I normally walk my dog in the evenings, but one day I'm kind of like, ugh, I don't feel like doing it. Well, then I'm ambivalent because part of me wants to walk the dog. It's good for the dog, and part of me doesn't want to. So that's just normal ambivalence. But it can be much stronger than that. People can get stuck in ambivalence.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times that's really the focus of counseling, is to help someone get unstuck from their ambivalence.
Right. Right. So today I'm not going to walk the dog, or I don't really want to walk the dog, but we're going to go do it because I have those competing things. It is kind of normal. And it's interesting the way that you put it with therapy. Is so much of what I see in therapy is what I would call normal things that have escalated
Yeah.
to become an issue. So we can say, well, ambivalence is normal. What maybe is like an example of where ambivalence really gets somebody from, kind of what we'd call normal, I'm not sure what I want to do, or I feel torn, to being stuck.
Well, I do think that there are factors that cause some people to be more vulnerable to getting stuck in ambivalence. Okay. So, and those factors are, of course, whatever experiences they've had, whatever their beliefs, the beliefs that they may have developed from those experiences, like I'm not good enough, which is the subtitle on my workshop, on my work.
Right.
Or just how sensitive they are. We're born on a continuum. I always like to talk about my cats when I talk about this, because I have 2 cats.
Okay.
If I drop a glass and it breaks and makes a loud noise, one of them will jump, sort of screech, run from the room, and we won't see him for, a couple of hours.
Okay.
And the other one will look at me and as if he can roll his eyes and say, "You better clean that up." Right. And the same thing happened. They're in the same environment, but they react very differently. And I think it's just because they're wired differently. One is more sensitive to things that happen than the other. Right. So I think it's the same for people, and that there's been a lot of research on that, and it does, relate to brain chemistry and things like that. So these are the factors that cause someone to feel ambivalent. And I think the sort of the core factor, all those things can come together in a way that makes a person confused about their needs. Like I want that or need that, but maybe I shouldn't, or shouldn't have it, or don't deserve it. And then that's when they can become very stuck.
Okay. So there's something that I'd like, but I'm going to talk myself out of why I don't deserve it. And that might be my wiring. That could be, events that have happened to me in my life. I might have been told I don't deserve certain things.
Yeah, that might be part of the experiences you had maybe growing up. Mm-hmm.
Or I could, this is one I see as a therapist, maybe sometimes struggle with myself, if I'm honest, is I'm a nurturer, so I'm taking care of other people. So my needs, I'd like that, but my needs have to come after everybody else's needs are taken care of, which is a real trap, because you can always find other needs and other people to take care of. If you put yourselves at the bottom, it doesn't happen. I'm always, saying to people, if you're a tow truck and you're always towing people around and you never get your own engine serviced, eventually your engine's going to seize up.
That's a good metaphor.
So, and so I think that kind of leads us in maybe. So I've been wanting to ask this question because we're talking about stories, and I like stories. I like that, like I said, the concept of narrative. But you talk about some in your work about getting stuck in the story. Mm-hmm. What really is, do you feel like getting stuck in the story means?
So I think the easiest way for me to explain that is to sort of use an example of a person that I worked with. I'm going to call him John. And he had a little bit of he came into counseling because he had anxiety. And almost as a side note, he also wanted a relationship. He was successful, but his relationships always ended, and he wanted a long-term relationship.
Right.
And he was, when he was little, I learned as I got to know him, about around 3 or 4 years old, his parents divorced. And at that time, his dad moved out and his mom became depressed. And so he sort of lost them both. at the same time. Even
Right.
though the mother was present, she was, she just didn't have energy and she was depressed. And so,
Well, she was present without being present.
oh, nice way to put that.
Yeah.
Exactly right. And that in itself can be confusing to a child who can't make sense of these things. But
Right.
so what he did, and he almost didn't do it consciously, but this is what children do at that age, is they know they feel bad, but they can't put themselves in other people's shoes or think abstractly or understand all the factors that go into why a couple separates. He just knew he felt bad. And when children under the certain age are feeling bad, they usually blame themselves. There's a term for that, egocentricity.
Right.
Because they aren't developed enough to say, well, maybe dad or mom, grew apart. They can't think like that. So they just think, well, I must not be lovable. And that's what he did. He sort of developed a story in his mind that he wasn't very lovable. Otherwise, they wouldn't have left and mom wouldn't have gotten depressed.
Right.
And then he adjusted to that story. He added to that story by saying, however, if I'm really good, at least maybe mom won't fully leave. And when I'm really good, mom smiles. And so it was highly reinforcing for him. I can't believe you brought up caretaking, because that's exactly what he did. It was highly reinforcing for him to push down what he wanted or felt. He certainly didn't want to cry and make anybody feel bad because they might leave. And so he just, he told me at the age of 4, he was already cooking with his mother. So anything he could do to help out. But if you carry that story through up into young adulthood, you have a person who's been telling himself that many years, 30 years, that he's really not lovable. He doesn't even maybe know he's telling himself that. It's more of a sense, kind of in his bones. I don't feel lovable, but if I caretake, if I'm really, really good to people, then they'll stay. They may not love me, but they'll stay. And what would happen is they'd be attracted to him at first, but then it was kind of one-sided and they realized they weren't really getting to know him. He wasn't really opening up.
Right.
So that story was causing him, he had that ambivalence, very serious ambivalence, where he wanted the relationship, but was actually afraid to be open enough to keep a relationship.
Right. I want to, because if you know the real me, you'll reject me because I'm so unlovable.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I'll just be really, really kind and loving and bring you flowers or whatever it was how he defined that. And that worked for a little while, and then it just didn't have the depth that you need.
Right.
So he had a conflict in needs, if you want to think about it that way. He had the need for security, that sense that you won't leave me, and he had that fear that somebody would leave, even though he had a need for someone to love him. So there was a conflict in two very normal human needs, and that's usually at the core of ambivalence and a story that's no longer working.
Right.
There's a conflict between normal human needs.
Right. That makes a lot of sense, and it's almost like a I know a lot of people use the term, but it's like almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. I've written this story. I'm afraid people are going to leave me.
Yes.
And then I accidentally or I'm subconsciously behaving in ways that constantly cause people to leave me, even though I think I'm doing everything I'm supposed to keep them.
Right. And then that reinforces the story because the person did leave.
Right.
But recognizing that your story is actually causing that. And that I think you probably can relate to is one of the saddest things I ever experienced as a psychologist, is to hear about the pain that people felt growing up and then watch them as they recreate the same pain in their adulthood.
Right. Because it's what they know. And you're asking me to do different things. I've long been very irritated, or maybe not very irritated, but have thought it's wrong when people said, oh, the definition of an insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, my experience as a therapist is people are doing the same thing over and over again, expecting past results. Mm-hmm. It's like this used to work, right? This strategy had some benefit for me in the past. And Absolutely. If I were to keep doing it,
That's a really, really good point. And if you think about John, it really worked. His parents thought he was coping very well. And his mom did feel better when he did those things. And so it worked for him for a while. She didn't know to wonder if he wasn't doing well when he seemed to be doing fine. And so in the long run, it didn't work, but it certainly worked during those early years.
Right. Now as an adult, it's time to do something different because I'm trying to have adult relationships with people.
Yes.
Yeah. And I find a lot of that in our clients, or the clients as I work with them. It's like, especially with trying to have relationships with a significant other, you have to have a different skill set. Or as my wife once told me, I'm not your mother. So in the middle of an argument, it's like, oh, I am having an argument with
every husband has heard that once.
So, all right. So we get stuck. We've got our stories. We get stuck on our story. We might be having these self-fulfilling prophecies. What are some ways that you can kind of say, well, how do I get unstuck from my story, right? Because there may be people out there thinking, no, I can see some stories I'm stuck in. What are some ways we can get ourselves unstuck?
Well, I think the first step is really to become aware of what you're telling yourself. So whenever you're feeling anxious or insecure, it could be that one of those old beliefs are running in your mind. So I actually have a list of common beliefs that children form when they're stressed, when they feel anxiety or stress. So sometimes I just ask people to look over the list because, like I said before, they may not even realize they're saying those things to themselves. So first is just becoming aware, and then considering from an adult perspective, and this is kind of where the inner child idea comes from. It's like you have this inner child that has an old story that worked, as you say, it worked for a long time, but now isn't. And that inner child needs, in a sense, to be reparented, needs you to now reevaluate what you learned when you were a child. And sometimes it can be even very helpful to think of the little kid that you were and then talk to that child, maybe the way you would advise someone else. To me, that's one of the most powerful, it's so very simple, but one of the most powerful strategies I know is to ask somebody, well, would you tell anybody else whose parents divorced when they were 3 or 4 that they probably weren't lovable? And of course, they're going to say no. All right, then let's change the way you're.
Right. Well, I've always said, and I've said this to clients, I wished you would give a little bit of the grace that you're so willing to give to other people to yourself.
That's right.
Or I'll put it into the third person. I wish you would give Bryan that sort of grace.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us struggle with the idea, and I love your example with John, because I think a lot of us struggle with the idea that we're not really lovable. If I was truly known, the people in my life would reject me, and I've got to hide that stuff. And it makes it hard for me to truly love other people because I'm putting this barrier in the way of doing it.
The opposite is so true. Just about anybody who wants to be loved, if they're truly known, they'll be loved.
Yeah, and I definitely think that's true. I say to my clients, I said, you're worried about being vulnerable. When you see somebody be vulnerable, do you think that they're weak or strong? And almost always they're like, well, boy, if they're willing to be vulnerable, how strong are they? And it's like, well, and when you see somebody who's self-confident all the time, are they really self-confident all the time?
Yeah. And also when you see someone vulnerable, are you drawn toward them? And a lot of people are. Like when I see someone who opens up or, shares a vulnerability with me, that makes me feel good. It doesn't make me dislike them. It actually has the opposite effect.
Right. It enhances the sense of connection.
Nicely put.
Thank you. Well, tell me, so we talked a little bit about John. Can you talk a little bit about helping get unstuck, like an example of the client, or what you did with John?
Well, yes. So I would start with helping, let's just keep talking about John.
Okay.
John identify what things he learned to believe when he was growing up and why, and kind of what rules did he develop, and then how were they helpful. And then and I actually have, like a template to work to go through step by step, and then to think about, well, how would you rewrite that story now? Could you rewrite that story now? And he came up with something that was really powerful. He said, if I were to rewrite that story, I'm going to, of course, paraphrase, but if I were to rewrite that story now, I would recognize that no 3-year-old can be responsible for grown-ups' actions. And that, in fact, I was lovable, and my parents told me I was lovable. That was just too hard for me to believe, given what I was already telling myself. And I see that kid that I was actually very resourceful, very kind, creative, loyal. And then we talked about how could he interpret that way of looking at himself into a way of being in a relationship with that. If you believed all those things now, how would you be different when you're meeting someone, or when you're wanting to develop a relationship with somebody? And then, we would kind of talk about what that would look like and imagine it, and even act. So sometimes when you're trying to rewire your brain, it takes a while, and you can act as if you believe it, even if you don't fully believe it.
Right. The true fake it until you make it.
Which, some people really don't like those kinds of phrases, and I get it, because a lot of times people feel like they've been faking it. Like the old narrative was, I'm faking being happy even though I'm not.
Right.
Completely different. This is, I'm acting like I believe something that I know in one part of my mind, my wise mind, I do believe it, and by acting according to it, it will serve me. It is like in line with my goals and values.
Right. I think it's to me, it's kind of like you have stuff that you know for a fact, but you don't know it for a feel.
Oh, where do you get these little?
I like to play with words, I guess.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, but I know for a fact. I don't know for a feel. Being kind of a product guy where I'm all the way up here and I don't always know how I'm feeling. That's been some of the work I've had to do. And so go act on what you know to be true in your head, and eventually you can get your heart to follow. I talk a lot about the symbolic self, which is really like the inner child. But that symbolic self, there's a lot of things that are real to it that we might rationally say aren't real. And this is the story, right? The symbolic self believes in stories, and believes in rituals, and believes in fables, and believes in symbols.
Yeah.
Just like a 3-year-old.
Yes.
Puts together the world, and 3-year-olds live in a world of giants. And I think when we're operating on a story written by a 3-year-old, we're a helpless person trying to run around manipulating giants. And if you think about mythology, how many mythological stories have a hero who manipulates more powerful forces by being clever? Right.
True.
That's all mythologies are full of that character. Often that character gets a comeuppance. And I wonder about the mythology of that, what that's telling us. It's like, yes, you can be clever and manipulate things, but eventually you've got to figure out who you are and what your place in the world is. So I love that the example that we've been talking about is, I'm 3, this is how I made sense of the world. All right, now you're 25. How do you make sense of the world? And I can say at 50, I make sense of the world differently than I did at 40, than I did at 30.
True.
I expect to be 70 and look, if I can make it to 70, I'm sure I'll look back on 50 and go, oh, what was I thinking?
Well, we hope so. We hope we keep growing and learning.
Yeah. So what would be kind of a good way for people to know, that they're experiencing ambivalence? Because I know for me, one of the reality is I'm not always sure what I'm feeling or or how I'm feeling about things. So when do I know ambivalence is up in my face?
Yeah. So like if you're having trouble making a decision, that would be a sign of ambivalence. Like part of me wants to walk the dog and part of me doesn't want to walk the dog. Or anytime you say, well, on one hand,
Right.
or part of me, then you know that you're experiencing two different things. And what most people try to do is choose between the two. Like one is right and one is wrong. And actually, usually they wouldn't both be there unless they both had some wisdom. So
Right.
I think it takes it's a little more effort, but say, oh, clearly I'm feeling ambivalent. What is the wisdom on both sides? And how can I come up with a solution that sort of honors both? So whenever you're having trouble making a decision, if you are procrastinating something, which is similar to having trouble making a decision, but you think you've made the decision, but you just keep not doing it.
Right.
You know, making that doctor's appointment or whatever, that's usually a sign of ambivalence. If you don't pause and say, wonder why I'm not doing that. What we tend to do is we just guilt ourselves. Oh, I'm going to do it tomorrow. And we don't ever pause and sort of become aware, and probably will just stay torn, or we'll impulsively take one side or the other. And maybe that wasn't exactly what we needed to do. Maybe we needed to pause and find, a compromise, or maybe sometimes there's a third way out that we haven't even thought of until we pause.
Right.
Even, and I hate to use this word because people think it's so bad, but even manipulating is a sign of ambivalence. And what I mean by that is that if I grew up with part of my story being I shouldn't get a need met or my needs met, then I probably won't ask directly for my needs to be met, but I'll still need them to be met. That's what a need is. So instead of saying, I really wish we could stay home tonight and not go out, or maybe vice versa if it's better these days, I might just pout and wish the other person could figure out what I was thinking. I have trouble giving myself permission to say it directly, but I wish you'd figure it out. Well, that's a mild form of manipulation. So if we find ourselves unable to ask for things directly, that's probably ambivalence.
Right. And I fully agree with you on manipulation. And I've had this conversation with staff over the years. And that what would they will say, dismiss a client by saying they're just being manipulative. And I'll say, we're all manipulative all the time. It's the first skill that we learn to get our needs met because we're helpless. And we're constantly doing things to manipulate others. To me, the question is, are you doing it mindfully? And are you doing it appropriately? Right? And passive aggressively pouting because you can't read my mind isn't great for whatever relationship that you're in.
Yeah, it might be understandable that it's scary to do it, but it's not effective. Right.
That still doesn't stop me from sometimes asking my wife to come flip my omelet for me. It's like, I don't really want to flip this because it's just, I get scrambled eggs with stuff in it, and she's able to flip it for me. But that's a type of, my manipulation can be, the example there, the good way is to say, please come flip my omelet for me. I would like you to do it because it'll be better, as opposed to going through a big long list of trying to kind of con her into it and almost guilt her into it. Yeah. It's like,
excuses as to why you can't in the moment.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And it's a lovely interchange to be able to ask directly for what you need. And it's also a compliment to the person. So it can be really lovely, but it can also just go off the rails so easy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So so you talked just a little bit about, before I started talking about manipulation, you started talking a little bit about maybe a third way or managing ambivalence. And so some ways people can resolve it. I mean, it sounds like one of the things that you're really talking about is I've first recognized the ambivalence and then sit with it a little bit. Well, maybe are these two different impulses trying to tell me?
Yes. Yeah. So, well, I think a simple strategy when you're feeling ambivalent is just to compromise. So, and that's not exactly the sitting with, but I'll get to that. But so back to the walking the dog example. If it is pouring down rain, I'm not going to be ambivalent. I'm just not going to walk her. If I am really sick, I'm not going to be ambivalent. I'm just not going to walk her. Most days I walk her. Then there are some days where I'm a little bit tired. And so I'm ambivalent. And so what I have learned to do, and I just trust myself now that if part of me wants to walk her and part of me doesn't, then there is reason on both sides. And maybe one part's coming from maybe the kind of the kid in me that just wants to go in and watch TV, and the other part's coming from more maybe the rule follower in me that thinks I should walk her every day. And so I have these two different parts, and they're both valid. And so I've learned to just go 50%. So instead of the normal 25-minute walk or whatever it is, I'm going to split it right down the middle, almost like I have two kids. I'm going to take care of them both. Okay, we're going to do half. So in a lot of situations, you can just cut through it that way. You don't have to come up with the perfect answer, because maybe the perfect answer is kind of a little bit of both. In more complicated situations, it is more of a sitting with and maybe asking yourself, is there some part of my old narrative running right now? I do want this, but I'm afraid of it. So what am I telling myself that makes me afraid or anxious? Or what am I telling myself that's making me avoid? And then, well, what would I tell a friend in a situation like this? So there are steps you can go through to begin the habit of sort of getting to know your story and what needs to be reevaluated or shifted somewhat. And I do some really fun things to help people do that. I do some things where I actually say, well, let's put the part of you that wants to meet new people in one chair, and the part of you that's afraid to meet new people in another chair, and you guys have a little conversation. Right. And I'm a coach, and I'll coach them through it. But what I'm trying to do is help them fully express each side, because what typically happens when we're ambivalent is we just ping pong and we don't get to a resolution. And a lot of times when people hear themselves fully express both sides of their dilemma, they just come up with the answer.
Right. And now that I'm giving full voice to both impulses. Right. Yeah, I think that's really important. And a lot of times I do feel like the stories that we tell ourselves will actively be working to squelch one of the two voices.
That's right.
And the problem is, my experience has been, we squelch a voice, what happens is it just tends to get louder. It's like, I'm not going away, that you've got a need and I'm coming out somewhere. And if you don't pay attention to me, I'm just going to get louder and louder in different ways.
I'm going to come out sideways.
Yeah. And you're not going to be happy about it, but it's going to happen. It's so funny you talk about, though, the different pulls, because that really speaks to something that's happened to me in this year in my life, which is a sense of setting aside the old story that if I'm not being productive, I'm wasting time. Right. So I have a learning disability, and I had to study in school. And, a lot of times it felt like when I was in school, if I wasn't studying, I was goofing off, I was wasting time. So I needed to study. And this kind of carried over into work. Well, now I'm doing private practice. I'm doing a lot of teletherapy at home. And I like to do some creative outlet. I like to do role-playing games. It's a creative outlet for me. And so what I've discovered is that's really important. That's an important part of my life. It helps feed my spirit. And it needs to be as important as doing some of the other work stuff. Just because it's work and it brings in money doesn't make those activities more important than things that take care of Bryan.
Right.
And so, but what I had to do was kind of listen to this voice. Why is this getting more and more insistent?
Yeah.
And it's getting more insistent and wants more noise, because it's like, Bryan, you need to take care of yourself.
Yeah.
So I think, and so I literally had to sit down and take this old story which kind of worked from second grade on, and say, well, work's important, but it's not more important than everything else.
Yeah,
I think it's a great example.
Yes.
Well, I think I feel like Dr. Buchanan, you gave us a lot of stuff to think about here today.
Great.
So I will be posting all your information kind of down below in the comments down below. But if folks are more interested in following up on your workbooks or thing, where can they contact you?
The best way is to go to my website, which is www.lindapaulk, Paulk, Buchanan.
Okay.
Buchanan.
All right. Well, I'll make sure that I've got that and the links to your different workbooks and books and down in the comments. And I have really enjoyed our time together. This has been really great. And
Right.
and as course, as we say in YouTube, we're supposed to say link, share, and subscribe. Click the notification bell so that you'll get more time. And this has been Thoughts on Therapy, and we've been talking with Dr. Linda Buchanan. Thank you so much.
Thank you.